February 1862, the White House. A father walks alone into a small bedroom. The boy in the bed is 11 years old. He has been dead for 1 hour, and the letter on the desk was never sent. February 24, 1862, the East Room of the White House. Outside, a storm has torn the roofs off buildings across Washington. Inside, 400 chairs are set in rows. At the front stands a coffin covered in white flowers. Inside the coffin is an 11-year-old boy. His name is William Wallace Lincoln. His father stands a few feet away. His father is the President of the United States. A minister reads the service. The president does not speak. His law partner in Springfield once wrote that melancholy dripped from this man as he walked. Today it is something else. His wife is not in the room. She cannot stop crying upstairs. The president stays until the coffin is carried out. This is the last 10 years of Abraham Lincoln. The decade begins 7 years earlier, February 1855, Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln is 46 years old and running for the United States Senate. On the 9th ballot, he realizes he cannot win. He instructs his supporters to vote for Lyman Trumbull. Trumbull wins. Lincoln goes back to practicing railroad law. He tells his partner William Herndon that he is finished with politics. He is not finished. In the 10 years that follow, Abraham Lincoln will be elected president twice, watch his own country split in half, bury a second son, sign the document that frees roughly 4 million enslaved people, and be shot in the back of the head from 3 feet away. This video reconstructs those 10 years from 4 points of view. First, the body. Lincoln lost approximately 30 pounds in office. His doctor wrote it down. Second, the mind. Lincoln kept an envelope in his desk labeled assassination. It held more than 80 letters by April 1865. Third, the pressure. The Civil War killed roughly 620,000 Americans. Lincoln approved or overruled almost every major military decision. Fourth, the decision. On September 22, 1862, he issued a document that changed what the war was about. His cabinet secretary Gideon Welles recorded in his diary that Lincoln said he had made a promise to his maker. 3 questions wait for us. Why did Lincoln stop taking the mercury pills he had used for years? What was in the letter to General Meade that he wrote in July 1863 and placed in an envelope marked "Never Sent"? And what exactly did Lincoln see in the dream he described to Ward Hill Lamon 10 days before he died? The final decade begins here. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall. At his 1861 inauguration, by staff measurement, he weighed approximately 180 pounds. By March 1865, he weighed approximately 150 pounds. He had lost close to a fifth of his body mass in 4 years. The weight came off slowly and then all at once. For most of 1861 and 1862, his personal physician in the White House was Dr. Robert King Stone. Dr. Stone saw him for what the records describe as exhaustion, fatigue, and chronic constipation. For constipation, Lincoln had taken a patent remedy for years known as blue mass pills. The pills were standard 19th century medicine. Their active ingredient was mercury chloride, a heavy metal now understood to cause tremor, irritability, cognitive disturbance, and memory loss at sustained dose. Lincoln stopped taking the pills in the summer of 1861. He told a friend, Henry Clay Whitney, that the pills made me cross. His secretary John Nicolay, in notes later used by Carl Sandburg, confirmed the stopping date. Whether the mercury had affected Lincoln's moods across the 1850s is a question modern historians still debate. What is documented is that after he stopped the pills, he was still tired. He was still sad. The pills had not been the source. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania to dedicate a cemetery at Gettysburg. He delivered 272 words. He returned to Washington with a mild fever. Dr. Stone examined him on November 23 and confirmed varioloid, a mild form of smallpox. Lincoln remained in the White House through early December. A personal aide recorded that the president joked for the first time in weeks that he finally had something he could give to everyone. Lincoln's sleep across the decade is the clearest record of his body's load. John Hay's White House diary contains repeated entries of the president walking alone to the War Department telegraph office at 3 and 4 in the morning to read the night's dispatches from the front. Hay writes of Lincoln returning and lying on a couch in his office rather than climbing the stairs to the family quarters. His wife was sleeping with a doctor in attendance after the worst of her breakdowns. Lincoln's hands across the decade grew visibly older than his face. The Matthew Brady Studio measured and photographed him repeatedly between 1860 and 1865. The last set of sittings on February 5, 1865 shows a man whose temples have gone gray, whose cheeks have sunk under the bone, and whose eyes, in Nicolet's word, had ceased looking for anything. One physical fact belongs in the record and is almost never stated plainly. Lincoln had been photographed more than any previous American. By 1865, his face was publicly recognizable on the street. This meant that his weight loss, his sunken cheeks, and his growing stoop were not private. The country watched him age in real time in lithographs and newspaper engravings. The condition of his body was itself a piece of political information. This was the physical frame inside which every decision of the final decade was made. A tall man, hollowing out, a man who could not sleep more than 4 or 5 hours, a man whose doctor wrote it down. William Herndon practiced law with Abraham Lincoln for 16 years, sharing a small office on the second floor of a brick building on the west side of the Springfield Public Square. After Lincoln's death, Herndon spent the rest of his life interviewing people who had known Lincoln. He interviewed farmers, neighbors, cousins, the stepmother, the old girlfriends. The interviews were transcribed. They are now held at the Huntington Library in California. In one of them, Herndon himself wrote that Lincoln's melancholy dripped from him as he walked. The word Lincoln's own contemporaries used was hypo, short for hypochondria, which in the 19th century meant severe depression. There are 3 documented episodes from the years before the decade began. In 1835, after the death of a young woman named Anne Rutledge. In January 1841, after breaking his engagement to Mary Todd, so severe that his friend Joshua Speed took him home to Kentucky because he feared Lincoln would hurt himself. A third in 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By the decade in view of this video, the pattern was known to everyone close to him. Publicly, he said one thing, privately, he wrote another. To the country, he was steady and plain-spoken. In letters to close friends, he described a life he had to force himself through day by day. To Joshua Speed on February 25, 1842, long before this decade, "I am now the most miserable man living." By the 1860s, he wrote less about it, because by then his close friends were dead or far away, and the only place the evidence survives is in the diaries of the men who worked for him. John Hay's diary is the most complete record. Hay was Lincoln's 22-year-old secretary living on the second floor of the White House. He writes on September 25, 1863, that the president came into his office at midnight in his slippers, told a story about a frontier trial, laughed, and then sat in silence for 20 minutes. The Tycoon, Hay writes, his private nickname for Lincoln, is in a fine whack. The fine whack was Hay's way of saying it was one of the bad weeks. The darker register is captured in what Lincoln did with his desk. He kept an envelope visible and labeled in his own handwriting with the single word assassination. Into it, he dropped threat letters as they arrived. Nicolet inventoried the file after his death. It contained more than 80 letters. And the darkest register is the dream. Ward Hill Lamon, a longtime friend and sometimes bodyguard, published an account in 1895 of a conversation he had with Lincoln at the White House roughly 10 days before the assassination. Lincoln described a dream in which he walked through the East Room of the White House and saw a coffin on a platform surrounded by weeping mourners. Lincoln asked a soldier standing guard, "Who is in the coffin?" The soldier answered, "The president." "He has been killed by an assassin." Lamon said Lincoln told the dream with a tired, small smile and then changed the subject. Mary Lincoln, by this point, was hosting seances in the Red Room. Her medium was Nettie Colburn Maynard, who later published an account in 1891. Lincoln attended at least 2 seances. The purpose was to contact Willie. According to Maynard's account, Lincoln sat in the back of the room and did not speak. He was neither a believer nor a skeptic. He was a man who had lost a son, whose other son had died in 1850, and whose wife was slipping away from him in real time. This was the mind inside the body. The pressure was a war. April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln had been president for 39 days. The war that followed lasted 4 years and killed roughly 620,000 Americans, a figure later refined by historian J. David Hacker to somewhere between 650,000 and 850,000. Either number is roughly equivalent in proportion to national population to the United States losing more than 6 million today. Lincoln did not trust his generals. The first was Winfield Scott, too old. The second, Irvin McDowell, lost at Bull Run. The third, George B. McClellan, refused to move. Lincoln walked to the Library of Congress and borrowed books on military strategy, Henry Halleck's Elements of Military Art and Science, Jomini's Commentary on Napoleon. The lone record survives. He taught himself what he could. He fired McClellan in November 1862. He replaced him with Burnside. Burnside lost at Fredericksburg. He replaced Burnside with Hooker. Hooker lost at Chancellorsville. That was the week everything changed. July 1 through July 3, 1863, Gettysburg, George Meade commanding for 5 days held. Lee retreated south. Meade did not pursue. Lincoln, at the telegraph office, read Meade's dispatch and said to his son Robert that Meade had let the war slip away. He sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to Meade, dated July 14. He wrote that Meade had had Lee in his grasp and let him escape. He wrote that he was distressed immeasurably. He placed the letter in an envelope. On the envelope he wrote, "To Gen Meade, never sent or signed." The letter survived. It is in the Library of Congress. The pressure at home was equal to the pressure at the front. Mary Todd Lincoln had already buried a son in 1850, Eddie, age 4, from tuberculosis. In February 1862, her second son Willie was dying. Willie had fallen ill in early February. His physician, Dr. Robert K. Stone, diagnosed bilious fever, almost certainly typhoid, contracted from the White House water supply which was drawn in that period from the Potomac River. For 2 weeks, Willie lay upstairs while his parents came and went. Lincoln was in cabinet meetings about McClellan. Mary sat by the bed. Willie died on February 20, 1862 at 5 p.m. Elizabeth Keckley, who was in the room, recorded in her 1868 memoir behind the scenes that the president walked to the bedside, looked at his son and said, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth." He then went to his office and closed the door. Mary did not recover. She refused to enter Willie's bedroom or the guest room where he had died for the rest of her time in the White House. She began to hear Willie's voice. She hired a medium, Nettie Colburn Maynard. She went into prolonged seclusions. Lincoln wrote to a friend, speaking of his wife, "Her nerves have gone to pieces." The pressure closed the first loop of this decade. The mercury pills had been for something real. The sadness was its own source. It was not a poison he had taken. It was the life he was living. That was the week he understood. Lincoln's one private escape was a small stone cottage 3 miles north of the White House on the grounds of the soldiers' home. He rode there almost every summer evening from June through November of 1862, 1863, and 1864. A cavalry escort accompanied him along the road. The cottage had a porch. He sat on the porch in the evening and read. On the way, riders and pedestrians on the road recognized him and took off their hats. He tipped his own hat in return. One night in August 1864, riding alone at the escort's lag, a bullet passed through his stovepipe hat. The hat, with a bullet hole through the crown, was preserved. Lincoln asked the cavalry guard not to mention it to his wife. He wrote the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation at the soldiers' home cottage in the summer of 1862. He read it aloud to the cabinet on July 22, 1862. Seward persuaded him to hold it until a Union battlefield result could stand behind it. Lincoln agreed and placed the draft in a drawer. On September 17, 1862, the Union Army under McClellan stopped Lee at Antietam Creek in Maryland. 22,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. It was not a clear victory. It was enough. Lincoln called the cabinet back on September 22. He read the proclamation. Wells recorded in his diary that evening that Lincoln had said he had made a solemn vow to himself and to his Maker that if Lee were driven back, he would sign. Lincoln signed. The final decision of Lincoln's final decade was made in the upstairs office of the White House across a calendar of 29 months. It began in July 1862. It was formalized in September 1862. It became permanent on January 1, 1863. It reached its full philosophical statement on March 4, 1865. It ended on April 14, 1865. Watch the sequence in detail. July 13, 1862. Lincoln was riding in a carriage to the funeral of Edwin Stanton's infant son. Seated beside him were Seward and Wells. Wells' diary records that Lincoln, for the first time, said out loud that emancipation was now in his mind. He said the government could not continue fighting if it did not strike at the institution at the root of the rebellion. July 22, 1862. Lincoln read the first draft of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to the cabinet in his upstairs office. Seward objected not on principle but on timing. He said, "If we issue it now after a string of defeats, the world will read it as our last cry for help." Lincoln agreed. He placed the draft in his desk. September 17, 1862, Antietam, Lee was stopped. McClellan did not pursue. Lincoln chose to read the result as sufficient. September 22, 1862, Lincoln called the cabinet back. Wells recorded the words, "I made a solemn vow to my Maker that if Lee were driven back from Maryland, I would crown the result by the declaration of freedom to the slaves." He read the preliminary proclamation. It would take effect January 1, 1863 in any state still in rebellion. The alternative Lincoln had considered and rejected was compensated gradual emancipation, a plan to pay border state slaveholders for freeing enslaved people over a timeline extending to 1900. He had proposed it to border state congressmen on July 12, 1862 at a White House meeting. They refused. The meeting lasted 1 hour. The record survives in the collected works. A second alternative, constantly pressed on him by his own Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, was military emancipation by commanders in the field. Let the generals free the enslaved as they advanced. Lincoln rejected this. He said the power had to come from the president acting under war powers. He wanted the decision to be, as he put it, an act of fit and necessary war measure. January 1, 1863. Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. His right hand was numb from 3 hours of New Year's Day handshaking. He told Seward, "If my hand trembles when I sign, they will say I had compunctions. I had none. But my hand is tired." He steadied his hand and signed slowly so the signature would be firm. The cost was private. Painter Francis Carpenter lived in the White House for 6 months in 1864 and later published his conversations with Lincoln. Lincoln told him that the proclamation had cost him sleep, appetite, and close friends among the war Democrats who accused him of betrayal. He said he believed history would narrow down to the proclamation. He said he had staked his presidency on it. March 4, 1865. Lincoln was re-inaugurated. The second inaugural was 701 words. He did not celebrate victory. He spoke of both sides reading the same Bible. He said that if God willed the war continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, the judgments of the Lord were still true and righteous. This was not the language of a politician. It was the language of a man who had been inside a single decision for almost 3 years and had concluded that it did not belong to him. He rode back to the White House in a carriage with his son Tad. He told his wife later that night that he felt for the first time that the weight was coming off. April 14, 1865. He was shot from 3 feet behind at Ford's Theater. Actor Duringer left occipital region unconscious on impact. The decision that defined the decade held. The man who made it did not. He never fully recovered from that night. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. Lincoln held a cabinet meeting that morning and discussed Reconstruction. General Grant was scheduled to accompany him to the theater but declined. Julia Grant did not want to sit with Mary Lincoln. At noon, Lincoln ate lunch with his son Tad. In the afternoon, he took a carriage ride with his wife. She later told friends that he was cheerful. He said he wanted to visit California when his term ended. He said he wanted to see the Pacific. At 8:30 p.m., the Lincolns arrived at Ford's Theater. At 10:15 p.m. during the third act of Our American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth entered the state box, placed a .44 caliber Derringer 3 feet behind Lincoln's left ear and fired. The bullet traveled diagonally through the brain. Dr. Charles Leal reached him within minutes. Leal wrote in his same night report that the wound was mortal. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house and laid diagonally on a bed too short for his frame. Abraham Lincoln died at 7 hours and 22 minutes past midnight on April 15, 1865, in a rented bedroom 48 hours and 7 minutes after he signed his last executive order. That was the final decade of Abraham Lincoln, the last 10 years of a man who shaped the world. And this is what they actually looked like from the records that survived. If you want to see what power actually costs, subscribe. Every week, one more final decade. Next week, Moscow, 1953. An old man collapses on the floor of his dacha. His doctors have been arrested. His guards are afraid to enter the room. He lies there for almost 12 hours. And the man who will inherit the country is already sitting in the next room with his coat still on. Every claim in this video is sourced to a documented historical record. No speculation, no invented quotes. Terminal Decade is an analytical history project.